So my name is Troy. This is Organic Gardening Made Easy. In the past, this workshop has been given over 8 months of the year or thereabouts as little segments, and today we're just going to do it all as a one and done. And so we're going to go for a couple hours, then we'll take a lunch break, and then we'll come back and do some more. Okay, so when we talk about gardening, there are lots of different ways that terminology that we use. Today we're going to talk about organic, but we really kind of have to define what that means, and then all of these other related organic-ish terms, we can talk about them. So the first organic is the little o organic, and that is more of the common definition that just means no chemicals. And I think most people think that's chemical fertilizer, and it's also what would be considered synthetic or chemical herbicides and pesticides, and it leans more towards natural methods. Some people would say that no, it means that you don't get to spray for bugs at all, which is kind of a very challenging methodology. There are some pretty sustainable and not particularly disruptive methods that we'll get into after lunch, but that's the popular definition. The big O organic means that is the official trademark term by the USDA that means that you're part of the USDA program. And I know a little bit about it. My farm is not certified organic, but we've considered it, so I know a little bit about the program and what the criteria are. And then there's another one that's more of a trendy term these days called permaculture. And permaculture uses these different interesting systems that in permaculture they call elements, like rain barrels or water catchment and big elaborate composting systems and things like that. And that's not permaculture. Those are just some things that permaculture uses. Permaculture is really a design methodology, and it's basically about creating your homestead in a bullseye pattern where you're in the center of it, and the systems that you use most regularly are close to you in the next ring of the bullseye, and goes out and rings from there. But there might be a book in the library on permaculture. I asked them to get one. I'm not sure if they did or not. The next one is biological, and it has a big focus on the soil, the health of the soil. And it's worth considering because the health of the soil is going to determine the health of the plants and the things eating those plants. There was some great research done back in the 40s and 50s by a guy named Dr. William Albrecht from the University of Missouri, and he scientifically proved a link between the health of the soil and then the health of the plants, the animals, and the humans that were living off that soil base. So with biological, you're really concerned with the things that are living in the soil and the health of the soil so that you get healthy plants. And then ecological is related, but it's more looking at the farm or the homestead as its own entity and looking at the living systems in there and how they interrelate and trying to create a balanced system. The next one is veganic, which is not a very well-known term, but it's basically an organic system that uses no animal products. So they make all their composts out of just plant-based stuff. There's no chicken litter, which is a very easy organic fertilizer for gardening. It would just all be compost-based fertility. And then the last one is biodynamic, which is an organic method that has some very specific composting and soil preparation methods. It also looks at the whole farm as an ecosystem and tries to balance the different aspects of that system. It also makes use of some different natural and cosmic rhythms, and there's some different sprays to treat the soil and the compost to make all that happen. The big difference, it presents a big structural component on top of organic. So people in other parts of the world call it premium organic because it's a higher quality product. All right, why should we consider gardening organically? Most people would say because they want a cleaner food source, that their foods aren't polluted with chemical residues. And these days, some of those chemical residues can be pretty bad for you. It's also definitely very much better for the environment in terms of the chemicals that were being used on the soil. In conventional systems, all of the soil fertilizers are basically dissolvable salts, so they are carried away in the water as soon as too much rain comes, and so you get a lot of pollution in the waterways in that way. And there's no, we'll get into it later, but there's no way that those nutrients are being held. There's no way to bank them in the soil. All right, and so then, of course, all of that chemical fertilizer, particularly the nitrogen, it's usually put down in excess because it's going to get dissolved out very quickly, and so that excess nitrogen will boost up the bacteria and nematode populations until the organic matter in the soil is digested, and that's pretty quick with the addition of nitrogen fertilizer. And so then you basically end up with a sterile soil that has no life in it whatsoever. And so since World War I, or even before World War I, we switched from organic systems to more conventional systems, because initially they were much more productive because we had this millennium bank of organic matter in the soils. And so that's what I call the net effective neglect. And that's part of, when we get into organic gardening, the land base that we're looking at, we have to understand where that land base is kind of coming from so that we can then mitigate those effects and get back to where we need to be as far as a good soil health goes. All righty. So back in World War I, we had these nice humus-rich soils. We'll get into humus a little more later. But after the war, we had done a really great job creating our chemical industry to fight each other in the war with. And so then those chemicals, they found out that some of them were pretty good fertilizers. And so they started to market them to agriculture, and they were seeing huge rises in production from the use of those chemical fertilizers. And it was going so great that in the late 20s, they were plowing up millions and millions of acres in the West to plant wheat, and that was pretty great until it quit raining, and then there was then the Dust Bowl came, and that started in 1929, conveniently at the same time of the Great Depression. And then for nearly a decade, there was a drought in the west southwest part of the country, and a lot of that topsoil was lost just because it had all been plowed up and never. Then when it was planted, those plants didn't take, and the soil was loose for years and years, and it ended up just blowing away. And that was part of the whole boom of the agriculture and how well things were going back at that time. And then along came World War II, and everybody really got excited about working on that big project together. And then when everybody came home from that war, the kids that went to fight that war did not want to come back to the family farm. And so then the family farms were not inherited by those sons, because all the sons decided they wanted to move to suburbia and have a town job. And so the farms started getting bigger because they were getting consolidated. And instead of, at that time before the war, all the family farms were 50 acres in size. They all had 2 acres of vegetables, 10 cows, 15 pigs, and 58 chickens. And that was kind of the regular family farm model, and that was way more food than that family could eat, but everybody sold a little bit of their stuff. And that was the model of then. When we started to industrialize after the war, people moved into monocultures. So instead of having that very diverse family farm, people were farming a single thing because it was a lot more efficient. And when you go from managing 100 acres to 500 acres or even 5,000 acres, just to have less different things to do, of course, it's going to make you more successful. And of course, all of that efficiency led to these very mechanized and chemically intensive methods, which went on to compound the soil depletion that was happening over those decades. And all of that tillage became over tillage, and then of course they had all those big machines that were running over because everybody got rid of their horses right after the war, and everybody got tractors, and so all the soils just became these hard, compacted, almost concrete-like structures. And so all the humus had been burned out of them, all that extra chemical fertilizer dropped the pH, so the soils became acid, and of course by that time it was becoming apparent in the groundwater, and people were starting to get concerned. And around that time is when that book Silent Spring came out, because of all of the industrialized agriculture methods. And then 60s came around and people started to really start to see the impacts of that and started to think about alternative methods. So the question then becomes, why do we want to go through all the trouble of overcoming that nearly century-long net effect of neglect? Because to really rebuild our soils, that's a 3 to 5 year project. To get the humus layer back up, to get the microbial population and the worms back up, so that then organics starts to become easy. It's not easy the first couple years because you're overcoming everything that happened on your little spot of ground. But the reasons are that you're suddenly in control of your food. You know exactly what's going into it. It's definitely much more environmentally friendly and much more environmentally sustainable. I think that everyone will agree that homegrown is way better than the grocery store stuff, because the grocery store stuff is grown to be able to put in a truck and ship for 2,000 miles and still look like it's supposed to, not necessarily taste like we want it to, whereas our local stuff, we don't have to grow those super durable varieties, and we can choose to grow varieties that are flavorful and more nutritious. And then, of course, the last thing is within the chemical systems, there are lots of chemical recombinations that happen. For instance, people will spray Roundup on a field to kill whatever was there, or kill the weeds of a GMO crop, and then they'll add first phosphate fertilizer back onto that field, and the components of the Roundup that are left in the soil will recombine with the phosphate fertilizer, and they'll make Roundup again. That matters for us, is particularly if we are composting green waste that we're getting from sources that we're not completely sure of, particularly golf courses, because they use a lot of chemicals to grow that grass really nice, and it could have the chemicals that they use on the grass that comes in. There was a big thing a few years ago called killer compost, and it was people would get this treated grass, compost it, put it on their gardens, and it would kill everything in their garden.